On a cut of open prairie outside Morill, Nebraska, in November of 1953, a man named Marek Vitek began doing something so wrong, looking that wagon ruts formed beside the road from people slowing down to stare. He was taking bricks from a collapsed creamery chimney, black, heavy, soot-dark bricks that had spent 40 years swallowing heat, and he was setting them into wet lime against the outside of a Quonset hut. Not a brick house, a Quonset hut. A thin half-cylinder of corrugated steel, bought cheap after the war, bolted to a concrete curb, and famous for exactly two things: going up fast and freezing the people inside it half to death. Marek worked on the south curve first, one brick at a time, press tap, wipe next brick. The lime ran pale between the dark rectangles like frost in plowed ground. By noon, 3 men had stopped by the fence. Harlan Bell stopped longest. Bell sold Quonset packages in 3 counties. The buildings, the bolt kits, the end walls, the stovepipe collars, and most profitably, the insulation rolls that desperate families bought after their first winter. He knew the product well enough to speak about it like scripture. He stood with one boot on the bottom rail and looked at Marek's wall climbing up the steel. Then he laughed. "Boys," he said to the 2 farmers beside him, "you are watching a man turn a tin shed into a grave." Marek heard it. He set another brick. Bell raised his voice, not to help, but to be heard. That shell is made to carry wind and snow. Not a dead chimney. You hang 10,000 pounds on one side of that arch, and the first hard thaw will peel it off like bark. The seams will open, the bolts will wobble, the whole south side will fold. The farmers nodded because Bell sounded like a man with catalogs behind him. Marek did not argue. He only dipped his trowel again and pressed the next black brick into place. Tap, tap still. What none of them understood was that Marek was not trying to make a wall stronger. He was trying to make it remember. The Viteks had come to Nebraska the year before with 2 crates, 3 wool coats, and the kind of hope people carry when they have already lost too much to complain. Marek had been a mason in Moravia, where winter was not gentle, but stone houses knew how to behave. Walls there did not simply block weather. They held the day. Bread ovens gave heat back through the night. Tile stoves breathed warmth long after the fire had died. In Nebraska, the family had been given land, a view of endless sky, and a surplus Quonset that looked practical until December found it. Their first winter in that hut was not a season. It was an argument they lost every night. The steel did not merely fail to keep cold out. It invited cold in. Wind snapped across the prairie and struck the curved ribs with a metallic whine. Frost grew on the inside of the wall in white scales. A kettle left too near the outer curve froze with a skin of ice thick enough to crack with a spoon. At night, warm air rose toward the highest part of the arch, and the floor stayed bitter enough that Marek's wife, Anka, placed folded feed sacks under their son's bed, so the cold from the concrete would not climb into him. The propane heater ran until its metal casing ticked and shuddered. Still, Anka could see her breath when she dressed before dawn. Their little boy, Tomas, learned to sleep wearing mittens. That was the part that broke Marek. Not the bills, not the jokes, not the humiliation of owning a shelter that needed to be survived. It was watching a child sleep like a traveler caught outdoors. By spring, Bell had his answer ready. He drove out with a sample square of fiberglass tucked under one arm and told Marek that every Quonset needed the same cure: frame the inside, stuff the ribs, cover the batting, seal the leaks, burn more fuel. "It is the only sensible way," Bell said. "You make a blanket inside the can." Marek rubbed the fiberglass between 2 fingers. It was light as dry grass. "And the steel?" he asked. "What about it? It still becomes cold." Bell frowned. "That is what the insulation is for." Marek looked at the southern curve of the hut, bright under the April sun, reflecting heat back into the empty sky. "No," he said quietly. "A blanket is good for a man who already has heat. This house has nothing to hold it. Bell took that as immigrant stubbornness. Merrick took it as a design problem in May. When other men were mending fences, he hitched a borrowed trailer and went to the burned-out creamery east of town. Its brick chimney had collapsed in a storm years earlier. The owner wanted the rubble gone. Merrick wanted only certain pieces, the dense inner bricks that had faced the old boiler flue, bricks darkened by decades of coal fire. Bricks so heavy that 2 of them made the trailer springs complain. He did not collect them as salvage. He selected them like tools. Each morning he laid a row of bricks in full sun. By late afternoon he touched them with the back of his hand. The pale common bricks warmed quickly and cooled quickly. The darker flue bricks stayed hot long after shade crossed them. Some held heat like a sleeping animal. Those went into the chosen pile. He cleaned old mortar off their edges. He sorted them by size. He mixed lime, sand, a little clay, and ash into a mortar that stayed forgiving after it set. Portland cement would have made a rigid shell. Merrick wanted a body that could move without tearing itself apart. By September, nearly 7 tons of black brick lay along the south side of the hut. Bell called it foolish. The carpenter in town called it dangerous. One neighbor called it a foreign oven. Merrick called it a hearth. He began at the base, where the steel met the concrete curb. He did not load the wall like a stack leaning on tin. He keyed the first courses onto a narrow masonry foot ledge he had poured himself, then tied the brick skin back to the Quonset ribs with small bent straps set into the mortar joints. The straps were not meant to carry the weight. They were meant to keep the skin close. The weight belonged downward, course into course, brick, into the ledge and the earth. He left a narrow breathing space where the corrugations needed it. He used lime so moisture could leave. He worked only on the faces that the winter sun would strike, the long southern sweep, and a shorter wrap around the west end, where the late afternoon light came low and hard. The north side he left bare because it would never earn its keep. From the road, the hut looked ridiculous, a metal animal growing a dark shell. Inside Merrick's mind, it was simple. The prairie already delivered free heat every clear winter day. The problem was that the steel threw it away. Merrick meant to catch it. The first test came before the deep cold. In late October, after 3 bright days and hard frosty nights, Anka noticed the change before anyone else did. The stove had gone out near midnight. Normally that meant waking to a house that felt abandoned by the living. This time she stepped onto the floor and did not flinch. The air was cool, but the cold no longer fell from the wall like water. She crossed the room and placed her palm against the inner steel where the black brick sat outside. It was not warm enough to startle her. That was what startled her. It was simply not cold. She stood there for a long moment with her hand on the metal, listening to Thomas breathe under 1 blanket instead of 3. Merrick opened his eyes. "Well?" he asked. Anka did not turn around. "It is still yesterday in this wall," she said. By December, winter came down from Canada with its teeth showing. The newspapers called it a hard front. The ranchers called it a blue norther. Whatever name it carried, it came as a week of dry wind and iron cold. The temperature sank below 0 6 nights in a row. On the 4th night, a thermometer outside the feed store read 21 below before sunrise. Hinges stiffened. Truck batteries died. Water buckets froze with their handles standing upright in the ice. Bell was busy. A furnace he had installed failed at the Lindholm place when the fuel line gelled. Then a second call came from a family whose insulated Quonset still had frost behind the wall panels. Bell spent the day crawling under tanks, thawing lines with rags and careful heat, cursing the weather, and telling customers the same thing he always told them: more insulation, better seals, bigger heater. By late afternoon, he was driving home past the Vitek place when his own truck coughed twice and died. The engine turned over, then refused. The wind hit the cab as soon as the heat faded. In 5 minutes, Bell's toes began to ache. In 10, the windshield started filming white around the edges. He looked across the field and saw Merrick's Quonset, the strange dark band on its south side facing the last weak sun. At first he hated the sight of it. Then he noticed the snow. Every fence post wore rime. Every roof edge smoked with blown powder. Every steel tank in sight had a hard white crust. But along the base of Merrick's black brick wall, the snow had pulled back in a thin, ragged line, as if an invisible hand had dragged a finger through it. Belle leaned toward the windshield. The bricks were dark. Not frosted. Not white. Dark, the sun had already dropped behind the low clouds, but the wall still looked awake. A faint mist lifted from one patch where wind-driven frost struck the bricks and vanished. Belle stared until the cold in the cab became more convincing than pride. He left the truck, bent into the wind, and crossed the field. By the time he reached Merrick's door, his cheeks were numb, and his hands could barely close. He knocked with the side of his fist. Merrick opened the door without expression. Belle stepped inside, expecting the familiar Quonset punishment: floor cold, wall cold, air moving in invisible sheets. Instead he met stillness, not furnace heat, not parlor warmth stillness. A room that did not seem to be fighting. Anka was kneading dough on the table. Tomas sat near the south wall, repairing a toy wagon with a nail and a scrap of wood. He wore a sweater, not a coat. The propane heater in the corner was quiet. Belle stamped snow off his boots and tried not to look amazed. Merrick handed him coffee. Only then did Belle notice the two enamel pails. One stood near the north door. A skim of ice had formed across the top. The other sat against the inner curve of the south wall, directly opposite the brick skin. Its surface was clear. Belle walked to it. He looked back at Merrick as if waiting for a trick. Merrick said nothing. Belle crouched, touched the water, then touched the steel above it. His fingers found warmth. Not the sharp heat of a stove, not even the warmth of a living hand. Something quieter, a deep, stored mildness coming through metal, that should have been cruel. Belle kept his palm there. The longer he held it, the more wrong his old certainty felt. "How?" he said at last. Merrick set his cup down. "You sell blankets," he said. "I built a hearth." Belle looked at the wall. "There is no fire in it." Merrick nodded. "That is why it is cheap." To understand why that wall worked, you have to forget the usual fight against winter for a moment. Most people thought in terms of stopping heat. They thought of our value, drafts, blankets, caulking, layers. Those mattered. A house that leaks heat carelessly is a bad house. But insulation is only a guard at the door. It does not create warmth, and it does not store much of it. It only tries to slow the escape. Merrick's wall had a different job. It stored time. During a winter day, the sun sits low in the southern sky. That low angle is bad for summer fields, but excellent for a vertical south wall. Instead of grazing across a roof, the light strikes the surface more directly. Bare corrugated steel reflects and sheds much of that energy. Dark masonry drinks it. Those black flue bricks did not heat as fast as tin, but they held far more heat once they warmed. Each brick became a small reservoir. Thousands of them packed together in lime became a slow hearth spread across the side of the house. The important part was delay. If the outside surface warmed at 2 in the afternoon, the heat did not instantly appear inside and disappear. It traveled inward, slowly through mass, hour after hour. By the time the sun was gone and the air outside had collapsed below zero, the stored warmth was still moving. The wall did not make summer. It did something more useful. It made the night less violent. It shaved the edge off the cold. It stopped the Quonset from behaving like a tin bucket left under the stars. That is why Belle's hand felt warmth after sunset. He was touching the tail end of daylight, but winter was only the first trial. The second was spring. Belle had warned everyone that the thaw would destroy Merrick's invention. He repeated it less loudly after the night he took shelter there, but he still believed the wall might fail when the weather began its daily swing. Hard freeze before dawn, soft mud by afternoon. Sun on one side, cold shadow on the other. March gave him every chance to be right. For 12 days the prairie moved through freeze and thaw like a saw blade. Water crept into ruts at noon and locked into glass by morning. Fence staples loosened. Plaster cracked in 2 farmhouses. A shed door at the county road warped so badly it had to be planed down. Every few days, Bell found a reason to pass the Vitek place. He expected a crack, a bulge, a sheet of masonry slumping away from the Quonset like wet cardboard. Instead, he found hairline movement in the lime joints, and nothing more. The brick skin had shifted a little, breathed a little, and stayed. Merrick had not defeated expansion. He had allowed for it. That was the part Bell had missed from the beginning. He had seen dead weight. Merrick had built a living joint. The lime mortar gave before the structure did. The straps kept the skin close without imprisoning it. The ledge carried the weight. The corrugations kept a broken plane rather than one slick sheer surface. The whole thing behaved less like a tile glued to a can, and more like a masonry coat standing with the building. By April, the first winter's numbers could no longer be explained away. The propane man, Cecil Brandt, brought his delivery ledger to Bell's shop because he thought his own meter had failed. The Viteks had used barely more than half of what a similar Quonset on the Lindholm place had burned, and far less than their own usage from the previous year. Not a perfect comparison. No farm ledger ever is, but the gap was too large to ignore. Cecil understood dollars better than wall sections. He tapped the column with a grease, dark finger. "Whatever that brick coat is," he said, "it buys fuel without paying me." That line traveled faster than any explanation of thermal mass ever could. Farmers came in pairs at first, pretending they were only curious. They touched the inside wall. They looked at the pails. They stood outside in the low sun and felt the dark masonry with their bare hands. They asked what kind of brick, what kind of mortar, how thick, how high, why south, why not north. Merrick answered plainly. Dark material, heavy material, winter sun, slow release, lime that can breathe. Do not put weight where the structure cannot carry it. Do not copy the look without understanding the load. By the next autumn, 2 more Quonsets in the county had south walls darkened with salvaged brick and stone. Though each was adapted to its own foundation, one family used broken paving blocks. Another used fieldstone from a creek bed laid against a separate masonry backing rather than directly tied to the shell. The details changed because good old knowledge is never a costume. It is a principle applied to a place. Bell changed too, though not in a sentimental way. He did not become humble overnight. Men like Bell rarely do, but he stopped laughing. At first, he sold what people asked for. Lime, sand, wall ties, advice borrowed from the man he had mocked. Then he began telling customers the truth he had learned the hard way. Insulation slows loss, he would say. Mass stores gain, you want both if you can afford it. But do not confuse one for the other. That sentence cost him some insulation sales. It earned him trust. Years later, when newer houses began using bigger south windows, concrete floors, dark masonry walls, and words like passive solar, people in Morrill County acted as if the idea had arrived from universities and magazines. In one sense, it had. Engineers measured it more carefully. Architects drew it more cleanly. Builders learned where it worked and where it failed. But on that piece of prairie, Merrick Vitek had reached the same truth by hunger, memory, and touch. He had watched a steel hut throw away the sun. He had watched his child sleep in mittens. He had remembered the old tile stoves of Moravia, the bread ovens that stayed kind after the flames were gone, the thick walls that carried afternoon into evening, and then he had built that memory onto a building everyone else had accepted as cold by nature. The genius of the wall was not that it made winter disappear. Nothing on that prairie did that. Its genius was smaller and stronger. It changed the timing. It caught a few hours of mercy when the world offered them, and released them when mercy was gone. It did not roar, it did not glow, it did not announce itself as machinery. It waited all afternoon in silence, gathering light inside black brick. Then, after sunset, when the wind came back for what it thought belonged to it, the wall answered from the inside, not with flame, with memory. Marek Vitek had not built a heavier hut. He had built a slow hearth, and on the coldest nights that was enough to teach a tin house how to keep yesterday's sun.